The rain began as a whisper against the tent fabric, a soft percussion that came almost too gently to notice. You lay there, half awake, listening as each drop landed and rolled away, merging with 100 others in the darkness outside. The river was only a few yards from your campsite, its steady murmur blending with the growing patter of rain until it was hard to tell where the water ended and the sky began. The air inside the tent carried the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles, mingling with the lingering smokiness from the campfire you'd extinguished hours earlier. It felt like the world had wrapped itself in a blanket of sound, warm and close, yet wild and untamed. The small lantern cast a golden pool of light across the tent walls, making the rain's silver shadows dance in slow, unpredictable patterns. Your sleeping bag was snug and warm around you, but the fabric of the tent occasionally rippled from the wind, sending a chill through your senses. The canvas smelled faintly of waterproofing wax, a smell that, strangely, you associated with safety. Beyond the tent, somewhere in the dark, a branch cracked, the sound sharp and brief, a reminder that even in this cocoon of comfort, the forest was alive and awake. You told yourself it was only the wind. Still, your heartbeat slowed only after a long moment, soothed again by the rain's rhythmic touch. Earlier that evening, the riverbank had been a place of laughter and simple work, collecting kindling, setting stones for the fire ring, tightening tent lines against the forecast. You had walked barefoot on the damp grass by the river's edge, feeling the cold water rush over your toes. Now, lying in the tent, you could still picture the way the twilight had painted the water in streaks of deep blue and molten silver, as if the river were carrying the very last light of the day away. That memory warmed you almost as much as the sleeping bag did. The sudden gust of wind rattled the tent poles, and the rain picked up, going from gentle taps to a lively drumming. You adjusted your pillow, pulling it closer to the lantern's light, and glanced at your small journal resting by your side. You thought about writing, but the urge to simply listen was stronger. It felt rare to be this still, to let the world outside set the pace, to give yourself permission to drift between thought and dream. Your eyelids grew heavier, yet each sound outside seemed to etch itself into memory, making you wonder if you would remember this exact night years from now. Then, from somewhere upriver, there came another sound, faint but distinct, like a splash followed by the low murmur of movement in the water. It didn't sound like rain hitting the river's surface. It was slower, deliberate. You held your breath, listening more intently, but the rain seemed determined to hide the source. Perhaps it was a fish. Perhaps it was something else. Either way, the sound lingered in your mind as the lantern's glow dimmed with the draining battery, and the forest closed in just a little more around your fragile pocket of warmth. The rain was no longer simply falling. It was slanting in sheets, driven by a wind that roared down from the hills. Every gust seemed to scrape its fingers across the cottage roof, shaking the beams above Isabel's head. The fire hissed as stray droplets slipped down the chimney, a reminder that even here, in her small circle of warmth, the storm had a way of intruding. She wrapped her shawl tighter, her eyes never straying far from the man as he stood by the door, fastening the last clasp of his cloak. "You're leaving?" she asked, surprised at the way her voice carried, sharper than she'd intended. He paused, but didn't turn toward her right away. "If I stay," he said slowly, "it might find you." The words were strange, heavy with meaning she couldn't unravel. She moved closer, feeling a swell of stubbornness rise in her chest. "If you leave, it still might." That earned her a glance, brief but sharp, as though she'd said something dangerous without knowing why. Outside, something shifted. It wasn't the wind. She knew the sounds of the forest well enough to tell the difference. This was heavier, deliberate, a crunch of wet leaves. Then another. The steps were slow but steady, each one closing the distance between the shadow she'd seen and the walls of her home. The man's hand moved instinctively to the clasp of his cloak, loosening it again. It was the smallest motion, but it felt like watching a soldier preparing for a fight. The next sound was closer still, too close. Isabel's breath caught as she turned toward the window, but the rain distorted everything beyond it, turning the shape into a shifting smear of darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw the glint of eyes, low, golden, and unblinking. The stranger stepped in front of her, blocking her view. "Don't look at it," he said, his tone low and edged with something almost like command. She felt the absurd urge to push past him and see anyway, but some instinct deep inside her obeyed. For a long moment, there was only the hammering of the rain. Then, faintly, a sound that made her skin crawl, a deep, rumbling growl, not of hunger but of warning, as if whatever was outside was telling the man something only he could understand. His jaw tightened. "It's closer than the trees now," he murmured, almost to himself. And though the words made no sense, Isabel knew with chilling certainty that they were not meant as a metaphor. The crunch of gravel faded into the rain, leaving only the sound of the river's restless flow. You lay still, every muscle listening, your mind straining to separate one sound from another. Rain can play tricks, you reminded yourself. It can bend echoes, make a single drop sound like a footstep, a ripple like a whisper. Still, the feeling in your chest was impossible to ignore. Not fear exactly, but a keen awareness, like the forest itself had shifted slightly closer. You reached for the flashlight without looking, fingers finding the familiar cold metal, the ridges on its handle feeling sharper than usual. Your thumb hovered over the switch, but you didn't press it yet. Instead, you reached for the tent zipper, careful to move slowly so the sound wouldn't carry. The zipper's teeth parted with a soft rasp, just enough for you to peek out. A rush of cool, damp air spilled in, smelling of river water and wet leaves. You could hear the current more clearly now, a deep, unbroken rumble under the patter of rain. For a moment, you saw nothing, just the gray blur of rain against the darker shapes of trees. Then, a flicker of movement caught your eye, low to the ground, near where the bank sloped into the water that it was there for only a heartbeat. A silhouette, hunched and still, its outline smudged by rain and distance. The water lapped gently against it, as if it belonged there. You blinked, but the figure was gone, replaced by the ordinary shapes of slick rocks and flowing water. A trick of the eye, you told yourself. The rain was heavy enough now to distort anything. Still, your grip on the flashlight tightened, your knuckles pale against the dim light seeping from the clouds that a sudden splash broke the river's rhythm, loud and close. Your breath caught as the water's surface rippled outward in perfect rings, reaching almost to the bank where your tent stood. There was no wind in that moment, no rustling leaves, only the expanding circles on the river's skin. You thought you heard something beneath the water, a low vibration more felt than heard, like the purr of some vast, hidden engine. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if it carried more than just rain. You zipped the tent closed in one swift, quiet motion, heart pounding as you sank back into your sleeping bag. The warmth now felt like a shield you were reluctant to leave. But the thought pressed at the back of your mind. Whatever was in the river had been close enough to touch the shore, close enough to touch you if it wanted. And as you lay there, listening to the rain once more, you realized you were no longer wondering if the sound would come again. You were waiting for it. The thought of staying inside the tent, wrapped in warmth while something, or someone, moved along the riverbank, suddenly felt unbearable. Your body seemed to decide before your mind could object. You slipped the flashlight into your jacket pocket, pulled on your boots, and unzipped the tent fully. The sound of rain outside was instantly sharper, fuller, like stepping into the center of a drum. Cold drops slid down the back of your neck as you straightened, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and the faint metallic tang of the river. The forest around you had changed in the rain. What had been a quiet wall of dark shapes now glistened with movement. Droplets trembling on pine needles, rivulets racing down tree bark, low shrubs shaking as if stirred by invisible hands. The river was louder here, its voice insistent, carrying an undercurrent that made your ribs hum faintly. You switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the curtain of rain in a narrow, pale cone. The light struck the wet gravel at your feet, then slid across the bank, revealing the delicate indentations of fresh footprints. They were faint, blurred by water, but too deep to be from a bird or small animal. You followed them without meaning to, your boots squelching in the softened ground. The beam wavered as your hand tightened around the flashlight, tracing the trail toward the water's edge. The prints stopped abruptly where the mud gave way to a cluster of flat stones slick with moss. Beyond them, the river churned black and quick, the surface flashing silver where raindrops struck. You thought you saw something move beneath the surface, a pale shape gliding just under the current. But when you leaned closer, the water swallowed it whole. The wind rose suddenly, carrying with it a sound that froze you mid-step. It wasn't the splash of a fish or the crack of a branch. It was a voice, low, almost lost in the rain, but unmistakable. A single word, though you couldn't tell if it was in English or something older. It came from upstream, drifting toward you like it had been spoken directly into the water. The current seemed to lean toward you then, as if trying to carry the voice into your ears again. You stood there, rain dripping from your hood, heart hammering in your chest. The logical part of your mind told you to go back to the tent, zip it up tight, and wait for morning. But another part, quieter, deeper, felt drawn toward that sound. Your hand slipped into your jacket pocket and closed around the small compass you always carried. The needle trembled, then swung not toward north, but upstream.
You hesitated only a moment before stepping off the gravel bank and into the narrow trail that followed the river upstream. The rain softened the edges of the world, blurring shapes and muffling sound until even your own footsteps seemed distant. The compass in your hand trembled each time you glanced at it, the needle pulling stubbornly against the north, drawing you toward the source of the voice. The beam of your flashlight cut a tunnel of clarity through the dark, catching droplets midair like flecks of glass, each one vanishing into the blackness beyond. The forest closed in quickly. The pines leaned over the trail, their branches shedding water in sudden, heavy bursts that slapped against your shoulders and hood. Beneath the layer of rain was another sound now, a steady, rhythmic drip that seemed to come from just ahead. You slowed, letting your breathing match the pace of the river's murmur, until you could pick apart the sounds. Rain, river, drip, and then movement. A slow, dragging shuffle, faint but real, just beyond the reach of your light. You called out, not loudly, but enough to be heard over the rain. No answer. The shuffle stopped, replaced by the soft hiss of disturbed water. You stepped closer, the trail narrowing to a patch of slick mud that slid down to the river's edge. That's when your light caught it. A torn scrap of dark fabric caught on a low branch jutting over the water. It was soaked through, heavy, and clung to your fingers when you reached for it. The edge was frayed, the weave coarse, and there was something else, a faint, metallic smell beneath the damp. Rust? Blood? You couldn't tell. The river widened here, curling around a bend where the current slowed and deepened. The surface was smooth, almost glass-like, broken only by the perfect rings of raindrops. You crouched, sweeping the beam across the water. For a moment, you thought you saw the pale shape again, larger this time, slipping between shadows beneath the surface. Then it vanished into the darkness, leaving the water undisturbed except for the rain. Your fingers tightened around the scrap of fabric. Whatever was out here, it had left something behind. The compass needle jerked suddenly in your palm, swinging almost violently to the left, not upstream anymore, but toward the far bank. You raised your light, and for the briefest instant saw a figure standing there, across the river, still as a stone. Its head was tilted slightly, as though listening. The rain blurred its features, but you felt the weight of its attention like a hand pressing against your chest. Then the lightning flashed, and the bank was empty.
The figure was gone, but its absence weighed heavier than its presence had. You stood there in the rain, staring across the water, the compass needle still trembling in your palm, as if it were sensing more than magnetic pull. The river looked wider now, the surface dark and restless, but you could see the narrowest point, a place where a fallen pine lay half submerged, its trunk stretching from your side almost to the far bank. It wasn't a safe crossing, but the thought of letting that figure vanish entirely was worse than the risk. Your boots sank into the mud as you approached the fallen tree. The bark was slick beneath your hands, cold water rushing past your legs where the trunk dipped below the surface. The rain seemed to fall harder here, blurring the world into shifting sheets of silver and shadow. You moved slowly, testing each step, gripping the trunk as the current tugged at you. The flashlight's beam swung wildly with your movements, glancing off wet stones, catching the ghostly flicker of something pale beneath the water, always just beyond clear sight. Halfway across, the wind picked up, carrying with it that low, strange voice again. This time, you heard it more clearly. 3 syllables, drawn out, their edges softened by the rain. It didn't sound like a warning or a threat, more like a summons. Your grip tightened on the flashlight, and you pushed forward, reaching the far bank with a final lurch that sent droplets flying from your hood. The ground here felt different under your boots, softer, almost spongy, with the smell of moss and something older, deeper, like turned earth. The forest was thicker too, the trees packed close together, their wet branches forming a dripping canopy that swallowed most of the rain's noise. Only the river's voice reached you here, muted and slow. You swept the flashlight through the undergrowth, and for a heartbeat, the beam caught movement between the trunks. The figure stood there again, closer this time. No more than 20 feet away. It was motionless, its head still tilted, the rain slicking its hair flat against its skull. You couldn't make out its eyes, but you felt the direct weight of its gaze. The fabric of its clothing, if that's what it was, clung to its shape in heavy folds, the same coarse weave as the scrap in your pocket. You stepped forward, the beam steady on it, but in the blink of an eye, it was gone. No footsteps, no rustle of leaves, just absence, so complete it felt as if the rain had swallowed it whole. You stood on the far bank for a long moment, listening to the rain, letting your eyes adjust to the deeper dark under the trees. The figure was gone, but the forest seemed to hold the echo of where it had been, a faint pull that drew you forward. The ground was soft, absorbing the sound of your footsteps, and the rain above was muted to a steady whisper. Every so often, your flashlight beam caught the glint of wet stone or the white flash of a mushroom growing from a fallen log. The compass needle still quivered in your hand, guiding you along a barely visible path. It wasn't much of a trail, just a suggestion of flattened moss and occasional disturbances in the leaf litter. But the deeper you went, the more it felt intentional. Branches that should have blocked your way seemed conveniently broken. Roots that could have tripped you were worn smooth, as if others had passed here many times. You followed these subtle signs until the trees thinned and the rain opened above you again, falling into a hidden clearing you never would have noticed from the riverside. The clearing was ringed by boulders slick with moss, their shapes almost too regular to be natural. At its center, a shallow pit had been dug, lined with stones, its ashes soaked dark by the rain. Around it were scattered objects, a rusted tin cup, a length of knotted rope, a folded piece of canvas that might once have been a shelter. Everything looked abandoned, yet not neglected. There was no rot, no sign of animals having disturbed it. The air smelled faintly of smoke, so faint it could only have come from hours, not days ago. You moved closer to the fire pit, your boots sinking into the mossy ground. Beside the stones, half buried in mud, you found something that made your skin prickle. A small, flat river stone, perfectly smooth, with 3 parallel grooves carved into its surface. The grooves were shallow but precise, the edges sharp even after rain and handling. As you turned it over in your hand, a drop of water struck it, and for a second, the grooves seemed to glisten with a silvery sheen, like wet fish scales. Then, from the far edge of the clearing, a branch snapped. You swung your light toward the sound. There was nothing, no movement, no figure. But in the beam's reach, you saw a narrow trail leading away, straight back toward the river. Only it curved toward a part of the bank where you were sure there had been no crossing before. The compass needle pulled in that direction, its trembling now steadying, as if it had found what it was looking for. The trail from the clearing led you through a corridor of trees, so close together that the rain above became only a faint hiss. The air here felt heavier, as if it had been still for years, the scent of wet leaves deepened by something metallic, the same faint tang you'd smelled on the scrap of cloth. The compass in your palm no longer trembled, its needle pointed unwaveringly forward. You followed it, stepping over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches until the trees suddenly opened into a small bend in the river. It was unlike any part of the river you'd seen before. Here, the water's surface was unnaturally calm, barely disturbed by the rain. The current slowed to a crawl, so smooth it mirrored the dark canopy above like black glass. Your flashlight beam slid over the surface and caught no ripples, no drift of branches, only the dim reflection of yourself standing at the edge. You took a step closer, the moss underfoot giving way to a band of slick stones that curved along the bank like a shore inside a shore. The pale shape appeared then, not under the water this time, but at the far side of the bend. It stood partially in the shallows, rain dripping from its hair, its head tilted in that same quiet appraisal you'd felt earlier. Even from across the water, you could see its eyes now, not glowing, but bright in the dimness, catching what little light the storm allowed. Its coarse, dark clothing clung to its form, the folds swaying slightly as though stirred by some current that touched only it. In its hand, it held a stone like the one in your pocket, carved with the same 3 grooves. You didn't speak at first. Something about the stillness around you made words feel dangerous. But the figure did. Its voice was the same low tone you'd heard in fragments, now clearer, though it carried an accent you couldn't place. "You carry what is mine," it said, the syllables slow and deliberate, as if weighed. The grooves in the stone in your hand seemed to catch the sound, humming faintly against your skin. You glanced at it, half expecting to see the silvery sheen again. But it was dull, wet only from the rain. Before you could answer, the figure stepped back into the deeper water, not walking so much as gliding, the motion silent and fluid. The river around its legs did not ripple, and yet with each step it sank deeper, until the dark surface closed over its head without a splash. You leaned forward, searching for any sign of it beneath the glassy water, but the bend reflected only the trees, the rain, and your own uncertain shape leaning over the edge. You stayed at the water's edge long after the figure had vanished beneath the still surface, the stone in your palm growing heavier with each passing moment. The rain had softened, but the air felt charged, as if the storm were holding its breath. You turned the stone over in your hand again, the grooves fitting perfectly against your fingers now, as though they had been carved for them. Somewhere deep in the bend, a low vibration began to hum through the water, faint at first, then growing, until you could feel it in your boots on the slick stones. Instinct told you the sound was coming from the other stone, the one the figure had held. Without thinking, you crouched and lowered your own stone toward the surface. The moment it came within inches of the water, the grooves began to shimmer, the same silver sheen you'd seen in the clearing now swirling like liquid metal in the rainlight. The vibration deepened, and the mirror-smooth surface of the bend began to change. Concentric rings spread outward, not from where you touched, but from the center of the river itself. The water's calm broke, but not into chaos. It moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, drawing inward instead of flowing downstream. The river's current bent toward the bend like a great breath being pulled in. Beneath the surface, shadows swirled, shapes moving too fast to focus on, as if the bend had opened a doorway to something deeper than water. Your pulse matched the pull of the current, each beat urging you forward. Then the voice came again, closer now, though you could see nothing in the water. "Bring it here." The syllables were clear, the same weighty tone as before, but they seemed to come from both above and below the surface. You hesitated, stone hovering over the water, your fingers tightening around it. Every part of you knew that lowering it into the bend would change something. Maybe in the mystery, maybe deepen it beyond return. But a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the far bank, and there the figure stood again, waist deep in the bend, hand outstretched. Its eyes caught the light, reflecting not silver this time, but a deep, river green that seemed to ripple with its own current. The rain began to fall harder again, drumming on the surface in chaotic patterns, but none of the drops touched the water within the bend. The figure waited, unmoving, the river between you silent except for the pull of that low hum. The hum in the water grew deeper, resonating in your bones, until you could hardly tell if it was coming from the river or from inside your own chest. The figure's outstretched hand was steady, patient, as though it knew you would come. Rain coursed down your sleeves and dripped from your fingertips onto the stone, the drops rolling away from the grooves without sinking in. You felt the weight of the choice settle in you, to hold the stone and walk away, or to give it to the river and whatever waited beneath. Your fingers loosened. The stone slid into your other palm, and before you could think yourself out of it, you stepped forward into the bend. The water was shockingly warm, like it had been holding the memory of summer despite the cold night air. Each step sent ripples outward, yet none reached the figure. When you were chest deep, the hum became a chord, layered with tones you couldn't name, each one pressing against your thoughts like a hand on glass. You reached out, placing the stone in the figure's palm. The moment your fingers left it, the grooves flared bright silver, and the river exhaled. The still surface broke, not into waves, but into threads of light that coiled around your arms, warm and weightless. The figure stepped back, the light between you stretching like a tether before slipping away into the dark water. "It will remember you," it said, the words low and final. Before sinking beneath the surface without a sound, the hum faded. The bend returned to its perfect stillness. The rain fell normally again, splashing against the water without resistance. When you looked down, the river reflected only the stormy sky, the figure gone, the light gone, and yet your hands still tingled faintly where you'd held the stone. You stood there a moment longer before turning back toward the forest, the compass in your pocket now pointing true north again. That be why the time you reached your tent, the storm had softened to a drizzle. The river's voice had returned to its normal rush, blending with the sounds of the forest. You lay down in your sleeping bag, the damp warmth wrapping around you, and listened to the rain on the canvas. The memory of the bend, the warmth of the water, the pull of the hum, the eyes like deep current, stayed with you, quiet and unshakable. And somewhere, upstream or down, the river remembered your name.